So now that we've had a bunch of major automakers agree to commit to NACS in 2025 and get supercharger access in 2024, and on top of that, the state of Texas is actually going to start mandating that charging providers have to include a NACS port on their charging equipment, I feel a bit more comfortable saying that the adoption of NACS in America is more of a when, no longer an if. But I certainly think there's going to be some EV companies that drag their feet, and while it's fun to speculate on, okay, who's going to switch to NACS next, I think what might actually be a far more interesting discussion is who is going to switch to NACS last. It's kind of like the format wars in the past. You know, there's usually not much of a success when it comes to VHS versus Betamax or Blu-ray versus HD DVD. One of them tends to take over, and that quickly causes less people to buy the inferior hardware, which means they can't sell as many of it, so they kill it off. And I think within the span of like literally a couple weeks, we have seen so much adoption from huge companies. It's really only a matter of time before everybody gets on board, because I think they're just going to lose out on too much potential revenue if they don't adopt NACS. But who is going to push against it the longest? Who is going to stick with CCS1 way longer than all of us want to? There's probably some names that are already coming up in the comments, but when I ran the poll last night asking people about who they think is going to switch next, what was leading the poll was Hyundai and Kia as well as Lucid. And I think, okay, now might be an interesting time to speculate a little bit more on this, because both of those brands are mass producing vehicles with 800 volt plus vehicle architectures. Lucid is actually over 900 volts, but the reason these companies, even though they may be well intended, could not jump on NACS right away is because the existing supercharger network is currently optimized for 400 volt vehicles. And that's great news for Ford, it's decent news for Rivian, and it works perfectly for Tesla because they're all mass producing, 400 volt vehicles right now. And GM with the Hummer actually has a way, even though it's an 800 volt vehicle, to split the battery pack and just turn it into a 400 volt architecture. So even with the Ultium battery platform, it's a higher voltage architecture, but it has a very intelligent way of converting itself into a 400 volt one if it wants to achieve higher DC fast charging rates from a supercharger. But Hyundai and Kia, as well as Lucid, they don't have that same battery tech that the Ultium is rocking, which is why if they just decided, okay, sure, let's switch to NACS right now, if they went out and plugged into a supercharger, their charging speeds would be like pretty substantially limited. Because they can't hit their target of 800 or 900 volts, superchargers would basically charge as fast as a Chevy Bolt would, like around 50 kilowatts. And we can already see that happening when a Lucid or a Hyundai Ioniq 5 goes to a supercharger with the Magic Dock. They can't max out their charging speed very much, not even close. And that's a huge deal breaker, I think, for Lucid, because their whole shtick was targeting how they're the fastest charging EV on the road, and they can get up to 350 kilowatts if you find an Electrify America station that supports that, and that Electrify America station is feeling good that day, then yes, technically a Lucid Air can charge at 350 kilowatts, but they have been plagued so terribly by the Signet surge, as reported on by Out of Spec Dave when he did his road trip with the Lucid Air, and when Kyle Connor attempted the Cannonball record across the United States with the Lucid Air Grand Touring. It's the fastest charging EV on the market with the longest range, so why did it fail? Why was it slower than a Porsche Taycan, which doesn't have as fast a charging speed and doesn't have as good a range of the Lucid Air? Well, it all came down to the charging network. Electrify America did not provide the peak speeds that Lucid was hoping for, and this has been a widespread issue that lots of Lucid owners have been experiencing across the country. So they're actually in a far more challenging position. Like, frankly, I think Rivian is going to transition a lot easier because they have a lower voltage architecture. So when they switch to NACS, they can take advantage of the V2, V3 superchargers and likely get their maximum charging speed. It's not a big deal because the voltages sync up. Not the same story with Hyundai and Kia or Lucid Air, which is why they're probably not going to jump on this as quickly as everybody else will. And it may not necessarily just be because of pure stubbornness. It's because switching to superchargers as their go-to charging provider doesn't really solve all of their issues. They're still going to be stuck with limited charging speeds. So there's a few things they can go with, but none of them are quite ideal. For one, they could change their battery pack to be more like the Ultium battery, where you have two separate battery packs that are at 400 volts, and stacked together, they can create a high voltage architecture that supports those higher charging speeds. But when you plug into a 400 volt charger, you can cut the battery pack in half essentially and just charge each module at a time. That way, hypothetically, a Lucid could go to a supercharger and get the 200 plus kilowatts that they want. Or what it sounds like Peter Rawlinson is waiting for, they could wait around for Tesla to update the V3 superchargers with updated transformers on the back end, because as far as I can understand it, it seems pretty clear to me that the V3 supercharging cables and connectors are capable of supporting up to 1,000 volts. They just don't have the back end hardware and equipment to output it yet. A lot of people have the misconception that V3 superchargers max out at 250 kilowatts because that's just what Teslas max out on. So yes, because the 4 sexy vehicles all cap out at 250 kilowatts, that's technically as fast as superchargers can give out power, but they've never had a higher voltage vehicle to charge before. So now that there's probably more vehicles interested in joining the supercharger network, Tesla's probably having this discussion right now. Should we start updating our superchargers to support the higher voltage vehicles so that they can access better speeds, and that way the Ioniq 5 can charge above 50 kilowatts? Same with the Kia EV6, and yes, that would probably include Lucid as well. And I know a lot of your go-to response would probably be, why should Tesla spend extra money on trying to fix the problems that Hyundai and Kia and Lucid chose for themselves? They clearly designed vehicles without much in mind to the charging network, because both Lucid and Hyundai were just falling back on, well, we'll let Electrify America handle all of that. We don't need to build our own charging network because EA should be good enough. And clearly that was a mistake. That's why so many people have ended up selling their EVs, because they were so fed up with EA and they were unhappy with the charging experience they were getting. But because they were kind of designing for EA, relying on having that higher voltage architecture, now they can't really fall back on the clearly superior supercharger network, even though it's opening up to Ford, GM, and Rivian. Well, personally, I think Tesla might still consider retrofitting a lot of V3 superchargers to support the higher voltage speeds, not just out of the kindness of their hearts, but also because Tesla has a 1,000 volt vehicle launching just around the corner. That's the Cybertruck. They have confirmed that for us. It is no longer rumor, it's not speculation. The Cybertruck will be the first consumer grade Tesla that has a 1,000 volt architecture, which should mean it can charge probably around 350 kilowatts, maybe more. And I assume, similar to the Ultium battery pack, the Cybertruck, of course, they're going to want that to be able to charge at V2 and V3 superchargers. So it will probably have a way to split the battery pack in half and briefly turn itself into a 400 volt battery pack so that it can plug into a V2, V3 supercharger and still get peak speeds. I highly doubt Tesla would release a brand new vehicle like the Cybertruck and say, oh, well, this one can't charge above 50 kilowatts at all of our superchargers. You're just going to have to wait around for V4 superchargers, which, yes, Tesla says that's around the corner, but at least in America, they still haven't launched a single one. And I really doubt they want the Cybertruck to start from scratch and not have any access for peak speeds at the existing charging network. So very likely Tesla will have a way to split the battery pack in half. But because Tesla is taking their time with the V4 supercharger rollout, it might honestly make a lot more sense if Tesla's going to be boasting about Cybertruck peak charging speeds probably in just a couple months when we get our Cybertruck delivery event, hopefully in September, October timeframe. If they tell you that, okay, the Cybertruck can charge over 350 kilowatts, but then there's no chargers that do that, what's going to be cheaper in your opinion? Building out brand new V4 superchargers, or just adding some updated transformers and updated cabinets to turn V3 superchargers into higher voltage chargers so that you can just take your Cybertruck to an already existing V3 supercharger, plug in, and get 350 kilowatts? If they start retrofitting those superchargers with 1,000 volt capability, that benefits Tesla with the Cybertruck rollout, that benefits Hyundai and Kia with their higher voltage architecture, and yes, at the end of the puzzle, it will technically help out Lucid as well, which they need all the help they can get right now because they're the only EV startup that has demand problems. Their vehicles are already way too expensive and not that many people are buying them these days. And on top of that, if they're going to be the company still kicking around CCS1 when the rest of the industry is moving over to NACS, yeah, they have kind of backed themselves into a corner. So I feel really bad for them right now because yes, they've made an amazing vehicle with great efficiency, great range, and clearly a lot of people love the design. I don't want Lucid to die. I just don't want them to be stupid, which is why I complain about them a lot, because many of their decision making is like, okay, this is how you bankrupt your company. So what do you guys think? Is Tesla just going to say all hands off and say, no, we don't need to update our superchargers to support 1,000 volts? Maybe you guys can just wait around for the V4 supercharging network? Or do you think Tesla, for the sake of the Cybertruck and their competitors like Hyundai and Lucid, will they update existing superchargers to support those higher speeds? Whatever decision they make and however long long it takes them to come to that decision, I think is going to affect how quickly Hyundai, Kia, and Lucid all start switching to CCS. But I think one thing is pretty certain: VW, who is not working on the higher voltage architecture, is still probably going to take a long time because they're a European-based brand and they've been very happy with CCS2 over in Europe. And because they kind of indirectly own Electrify America, I think they're going to drag their feet the longest and delay the switch to NACS probably way more than we'd want to. But once it starts affecting their sales and so many other brands have switched to NACS, I do think VW will eventually get around to it. It's just going to take way too long. But everyone else, Mercedes and Stellantis, I think they're in fairly low production numbers right now, which is why it should be very easy for them to transition. I think they're smart and they'll probably catch on to, okay, this is where the industry is heading, so let's get on board with that. The sooner the better. But I just think we should be fair to Lucid and Hyundai and explain that, okay, them switching to NACS is not as simple or as seamless as everybody else switching to NACS. Unless they start fundamentally changing the hardware in their battery packs, then they could take advantage of the existing charging network without having to wait on Tesla to support a higher voltage. But again, that's a future solution. That doesn't help their existing vehicles that have already been delivered. So feel free to speculate along with me down in the comments below. And thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.